Good afternoon. Welcome to the FASEB webinar. The National Science Foundation supports advances in biological research. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for a few more people to sign on. So please stay on the line, and we'll get going. We'll get going shortly. All right, good afternoon again. Welcome once again to the FASEB webinar. The National Science Foundation supports advances in biological research. This is Ben Krinsky. I'm the Senior Legislative Affairs Officer in the Office of Public Affairs at FASEB, and it's my great pleasure to be joined this afternoon by my colleague Andre Porter, Science Policy Analyst at the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. Andre, thank you for being here.
No problem.
So just a brief outline of today's webinar. We'll start, as we already have, with an introduction to FASEB, some other information. We'll then proceed to an early history of the National Science Foundation. This is some background information about the agency and its place within the larger research enterprise in the U.S. We'll then segue to talk a little bit about what the NSF is today, in particular, how the agency supports research in the life sciences. We'll then talk about advocacy resources, in particular how you can be a stronger voice for NSF and what it does. And then we'll proceed to questions and answers. So to ask a question, we do have the audio lines muted for this webinar. It cuts down on the chaos of people trying to talk over one another. So, but if you do have a question, we do encourage you to please submit it in writing. As you see on this slide, there's a question box. You can just type in whatever you want to ask and hit submit. We will handle most of the questions at the end, I think, but if there's something really pressing about something we're talking about, we'd be happy to pause and address that as we go through. So first, for those of you who are not familiar with FASEB, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, we are a federation of 30 societies spanning the biomedical and biological sciences. Altogether, among those societies, we represent over 130,000 researchers at colleges, universities, medical centers, and research institutes across the country and across the world. Our mission is to advance health and welfare by promoting progress and education in biological and biomedical sciences through service to our member societies and through collaborative advocacy. So this is just a screenshot of our current membership. As you can see, I want to give a special thanks to ASB&B. We're very happy to have Andre here, one of our local experts on NSF. So first, what I think I'd do for the next few slides is to talk a little bit about the origins of the National Science Foundation. This is going to be far from a comprehensive history. The purpose of this is really to talk about what NSF is and its sort of place within the larger U.S. research enterprise. And I think that talking about how NSF got its start really does sort of inform what the agency does today in the context of U.S. research. So a sensible starting point here for this discussion is the Second World War, roughly 1942 to 44. There was, for the first time, a huge, large-scale investment by the federal government in research and development towards the war effort. There had been, of course, involvement by the federal government in research, including academic research, prior to the Second World War, but this was a huge mobilization effort, and in particular, the dedication of resources towards technology and science to defeat the Axis powers. One prominent example of this that many of you probably are aware of is, of course, the Manhattan Project, but many other breakthroughs, including the development of radar and the first antibiotics, such as penicillin, occurred during this time. So even though the efforts, of course, were focused on the war effort, even as early as 1942, policymakers began to think about how science might be mobilized during peacetime. There was a sense that indeed, having gathered all these resources and tapped into all the scientific talent in the country, that this might be useful for something beyond simply defeating the Axis powers overseas. So some of those early efforts came from Senator Harley Kilgore, who was a New Deal Democrat from West Virginia, and he in fact introduced legislation in 1942, 43, and 45, all with the intent of creating an agency to broadly support the sciences. Meanwhile, in the executive branch, one prominent person who you may be familiar with already was Vanover Bush, who at the time was director of the Wartime Office of Scientific Research and Development, which basically was the central office within the executive branch for mobilizing science and technical resources for the war. He had some very, very sort of strong and clear views about how he thought science should be mobilized for the public good also after the war's end. So around 1944, President Roosevelt asked Vanover Bush to make recommendations for the future of the U.S. scientific research enterprise in the ensuing decades. There's some controversy on this historical point. Some actually have speculated that because Bush had some very particular views about what he wanted to have happen, that he may have sort of engineered the request for this letter, but we don't have time to get into all the details, so we'll leave that for another time. But under this presidential directive, Bush convened a series of expert committees to inform his policy recommendations. The result was this report, again, which many of you may have seen before, entitled Science, the Endless Frontier. It was produced in 1945. By that point, President Franklin Roosevelt sadly had passed away, so the report was communicated to then President Truman. And included among its many recommendations was the creation of a federal funding agency called the National Research Foundation. So the National Research Foundation, as described in the report, would support basic research in the colleges, universities, and research institutes, both in medicines and the natural sciences. So really, Bush envisioned that the single agency would be the primary source of all federal support for basic scientific research across the government. And in one interesting turn of affairs, Bush was somewhat skeptical of oversight, or too much oversight, or too much meddling from Congress or other parts of the government. So he foresaw this agency as operating really autonomously, being totally independent of the government. Essentially, Congress would endow it, give it a large chunk of money, and then it would be led by eminent scientists of the day who would make decisions about what research to fund and where to fund it. So that attitude didn't really go over very well in Washington. In fact, both President Truman and Senator Kilgore really pushed back against this notion of creating an agency without greater oversight from the political process. And so there was a process from roughly 1945 through 1950, over several years, where there was a back and forth. And as they were disputing how this agency should be constituted, other agencies focused on specific missions and areas of research were created. For example, the Office of Naval Research in 1946, the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946 also, which is a precursor to the modern Department of Energy. And of interest probably to many of you on this webinar, the National Institutes of Health were reorganized more or less in their current form starting in 1948. So finally, in 1950, after a series of discussions, there was a political compromise, and Congress passed and President Truman signed into law the National Science Foundation Act of 1950. And in fact, this codified in some sense what the National Science Foundation remains today, and is very well encapsulated in the law's preamble. In fact, this motto is used by NSF currently, and that is that the agency exists to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. In its early days, despite these lofty goals, the agency did not receive a tremendous amount of support from the government in those early years, but that changed just a few years later in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 and beat the U.S. into space, which it caused a political uproar. There was a huge policy response, including the passage of the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, which of course created NASA. The National Defense Education Act, also of 1958, which put huge resources into science education at all levels, from primary and secondary school through college and graduate school, was really pushing as many people as possible to pursue scientific careers. And it was really during this time that the NSF really came into its own. Starting in 1958, its budget was approximately $52 million, but by fiscal year 1968, this was roughly the end of the Lyndon Johnson administration, the budget had increased to nearly $500 million. So that's a roughly tenfold increase over just a decade. And it was in that time that, as I was saying, the foundation really came into its own as occupying this very particular niche funding basic research across many different disciplines. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Andre to talk a little bit about what the NSF is today.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Again, I'll go over what the NSF looks like today, what its impact is across the federal government as well as across the academic field, and I'll also cover where a life scientist would likely seek funding at the NSF, as well as some options for outside of that particular directorate. And then I'll wrap up with what the NSF is doing towards their investments for the future. So as you see on your left, there is a picture of the new NSF building, which is in Alexandria, Virginia. Right now, the NSF, and from its inception, has been led by a director. So currently the director for the NSF is Dr. France Cordova. She is an astrophysicist. I believe she came from Purdue University, and she was conferred in 2014 by President Barack Obama. A part of NSF's leadership is also the National Science Board, which consists of around 25 members who are scientists both in academia as well as in industry, and they are actually the governing body of the NSF. So the National Science Board members, are in charge of funding decisions technically that go on at the NSF. They delegate that responsibility to the director, France Cordova, and she then delegates that to her staff in the various directorates. The National Science Foundation also exists, comprises of 7 research directorates. There are a few offices outside of that, like at the international office, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But the 7 main research directorates, which most people who understand NSF probably have had some interaction with. So here's an organizational chart for the National Science Foundation. There's been some movement. Some people have left. Some people have rotated out. But this shows you how it's kind of set up. So the 7 research directorates are the Education and Human Resources Directorate, the Computer and Information Sciences Directorate, the Social Behavioral Sciences Directorate. There is the Math and Physical Sciences Directorate, as well as the Engineering Directorate and the Biological Sciences Directorate. And we're going to talk about the Biological Sciences Directorate shortly, but there are also a number of offices. So there's the Office of International Science and Engineering that deals with kind of the collaboration between U.S. science and our international partners. And there's the IG office and a few others. But this is kind of a brief overview of what the organization looks like today. So what is the impact of the NSF? So right now, the NSF is, and if you remove the NIH, which is also a large funder for scientific research, the NSF supports 27% of the U.S. research enterprise. And if we talk about biological sciences or life sciences, the NSF comprises 69% of U.S. research funding for biological sciences, again, excluding the National Institutes of Health. In FY 2017, the NSF supported 359,000 individuals, and that included 41,000 investigators, over 5,000 postdocs, 41,000 grad students, and over 38,000 undergrads. This also includes, so the 359,000 number also includes other research personnel, so that's office personnel. Anybody supported by the grant is included in that number. Also, the NSF awarded 11,000 competitive awards in FY 2017, and that went to 2,000 different institutions. So these are academic institutions. These can be museums. Just anybody who's able to submit a grant to NSF is included in that number. So this also, I think this slide is important to kind of get an understanding of the major funders. So the top 6 funders, federal agencies that fund R&D in academic institutions. The NIH, of course, Department of Health and Human Services, of course, is the top funder, being a large agency. Most of this research funding is coming from the National Institutes of Health because they fund a lot of academic institutions. For years, the next funder has been the National Science Foundation. The Department of Defense, though, has crept up to take second place in the last few years. But you can see over the past decade, the National Science Foundation has been kind of the number 2 funder for academic researchers, with the other top 6 agencies kind of trailing behind in support. So again, we're going to talk about where a life scientist or a biologist would get funding. And we can't talk about that without talking about the Biological Sciences Directorate. So the Biological Sciences Directorate, and on the left you can see a organizational chart for how it's kind of formulated. It consists of 4 divisions. You see a 5th division, and I'll discuss that briefly in a second. But there are 4 divisions kind of that exist broadly on different topics, and then within those topics are 15 research clusters. They're organized in a way that should fall in line with the division, but there is some cross collaboration between different divisions and the type of research that they fund and the type of programs that they support. In FY 2017, because we're still in 2018, so these numbers are the newest numbers to date, the Biological Science Directorate reviewed 5,000, so they received over 5,000, but they currently have a triage policy, so they don't review every proposal that they see. They awarded 1,100 grants, competitive grants, and they currently have a 23%, or in FY 2017 had a 23% funding rate. Again, when we talk about numbers and who they support, the Biological Sciences Directorate, or Bio Directorate, supported over 3,000 investigators, 1,300 postdocs, 2,600 grad students, and 4,800 undergrads. So before I go to the next slide, there's another division. It's not really a division, it's more of a shadow division called the Emerging Frontiers. This is where the Biological Science Directorate pilots different initiatives, starts. It's kind of their pilot's place, with the idea that whatever is started in Emerging Frontiers then is handed over to one of the main divisions to support and to manage. If you're interested as a person pursuing a grant in receiving funding for the Biological Science Directorate, and they have, again, 15 clusters and 4 divisions, you're not sure, you can always send a one-page research topic or one-page research description of what you're looking for to one of the directorates, and one of the PDs will get back to you and maybe shoot your research topic or your summary to another program director to see if it fits better in that program. So there is some cross collaboration between PDs. There isn't this siloed effect that you see in other organizations. So this is an example of life science support across the NSF. I think a lot of people assume that bio does the only bio work, but it's supported across the agency. So you have, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is kind of an example of what you can find. So you have the Directorate for Education and Human Resources, you have the NSF Research Traineeship Program, you have the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, which is probably one of NSF's largest and more visible programs. You have the Advanced Program and the HBCU UP program, which are programs that seek to increase diversity in the professoriate. You also have the Directorate for Math and Physical Sciences that has the Chemistry of Life processes, the Physics of Life systems. You have programs in engineering. You also have NSF-wide initiatives like the RAU, Research Experiences for Undergraduate Programs, and as well as others. And I don't want to read the whole list because it's a long list there. And there are other programs outside of this that exist that a biologist or a person who is conducting biological research can use to get funding and conduct their research. So NSF into the future. That was kind of where NSF is today, kind of the programs that exist for biologists and what they're doing now. But in the future, the NSF is kind of, in the past year or so, the NSF has kind of changed the way that they have approached research, approached the way that they are driving research forward. And they've announced these 10 big ideas, and they're outlined or they're separated into, in my opinion, 2 different criteria. So these are targeted research or long-term research investments, and then processes. These are things that are, the processes are things that are going to be used to help drive kind of the enterprise as a whole, not just science. So in the targeted research, you have harnessing the data revolution, you have the future of work at the human technology frontier, you have navigating the new Arctic, you have windows on the universe, the quantum leap, and understanding the rules of life. All of these programs or these initiatives, these big ideas, appear to be directorate specific, but they are not, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, but they appear to be directorate specific, like the quantum leap. You would assume is something that is more in the computer and information sciences or solely in the computer and information sciences, but there is some collaboration across directorates and across disciplines. And then you have the processes idea. So there's the mid-scale research infrastructure, so increasing capacity at different institutions, investing more in research infrastructure for different disciplines. There's the NSF 2026 idea machine, which we'll talk about in the following slide. There's the growing convergence in research, which we'll also talk about, and the NSF Includes that I'll touch on as well. So this is an idea of the interconnectedness of the big ideas. On the right hand, you have the different directorates. On the left hand, and you can't read them very well, but that's not really the point. The point is to see that there is no one directorate who's in charge of any ideas. Rules of life, you would assume, would be a bio-specific big idea, but there's an engineering component, there is a math and physical sciences component, there is the SBE component, the education human resources component, and this interconnected graph is really showing you NSF's new stewardship model, which is focusing on removing the silos of disciplines and working more in a interdisciplinary way to drive science forward. So new investments underway, and these are largely about the processes, the big ideas, and the processes, big ideas that are kind of being pushed forward in recent history and kind of driving their big ideas forward. So there are the convergence accelerators, which I mentioned before, and the NSF 2026 big idea machine. So the convergence accelerators are really a way for the NSF to push forward transdisciplinary research and come up with transdisciplinary topics. Towards this goal, the NSF has already included in their budget justification to Congress $60 million in FY 2019 specifically for their convergence accelerators, and they have come up with, or they feel that two of their convergence accelerators are ripe and ready to be invested in. That's why they're investing $60 million. They're also they're also working with external partners to come up with $40 million in support of this. And so those accelerators that they have felt or they feel that are ready for fruition are harnessing the data revolution, which is similar to the big data initiative that was announced years ago by the Obama administration, and also future work at the human technology frontier. So how do humans work with AI, and how do we better facilitate that kind of connection? So that's a social and behavioral science issues, an engineering issue. There may be some life science issues in there as well. The NSF 2026 Big Idea Machine is kind of a new way for NSF to push for research. It's soliciting the full public for research ideas, which is kind of new. Typically, NSF goes to researchers, but in this new Big Idea, the NSF 2026 Big Idea Machine, any member of the public, and I think at their recent meeting they mentioned somebody above the age of 14, can propose a new idea, a new way of doing research, a new topic, and then there's a vetting process for that. This is also in fruition, and they're set to begin their first competition for the NSF 2026 Big Ideas this August, and making the first prize announcements, because these aren't awards, in August of 2019. So these are kind of where they are on these initiatives. Another idea that they also are, or another investment that they're also pushing forward now, and they've been working on actually quite a bit, is the NSF Inclu. So the NSF Inclu is an idea that is with the main purpose of increasing diversity in STEM, but doing it in a way that's more meaningful and more sustainable. So it operates under three components. There's design and develop pilots. So last year they put out a call for projects on the NSF Includes for different institutions, different organizations to come up with ideas for how to increase diversity. Now they're working to build alliances. So how do they connect these different hubs for increasing diversity? And then they want to implement a coordination hub to keep these post-award, to keep these different awardees discussing how do we disseminate the information, how do we disseminate, or the NSF disseminate the lesson learned from these different includes projects. And the includes is a acronym, of course, because NSF loves acronyms, for initiatives to enhance the U.S. leadership in science and engineering, discovery and innovation. So yeah, that's kind of what NSF is today. The bio director is where you would assume that the NSF is collecting, or assume is the only place for life science research to be funded. But as I mentioned before, there are programs in engineering and MPS and education human researches in SBE, social and behavioral sciences. They have a neuroscience program. And also the NSF is working in a way to be more proactive about how they fund research with their 10 big ideas, and as well as these new processes that are helping to drive kind of the research enterprise as a whole. And again, the NSF Includes has already made 27 awards back in 2017. They also have a report of how those awards are doing. I believe that's live on the NSF website.
Great. Thank you, Andre. So as Andre has just described, the NSF really has a very particular and yet central role in the overall research enterprise in the United States. So just to sort of summarize sort of the big picture about where NSF sits, you can really think about it as being broken down into sort of three major areas. First of all, the NSF fuels innovation. Its investments generate new knowledge, of course, through basic research, which in turn leads to all manner of transformative innovations. Secondly, education, again, as Andre has already described, is really another critical role the NSF plays. NSF supports the scientific education of thousands of students at all levels nationwide. And thirdly, and perhaps uniquely, the NSF is really positioned to support interdisciplinary research, and the one term of art these days you hear a lot is convergence, the idea of not just working between disciplines, but really transcending disciplines and having people work with bringing in expertise from very different areas of science and engineering and working together to tackle big questions. So in that same vein, the breadth of the NSF's research portfolio really undergirds the missions of other scientific agencies as well. The NSF is really unique in that it has this mandate to support basic research and education across virtually all of the sciences, social sciences, and engineering. And as a result, the knowledge it generates and the people who are trained through NSF support wind up feeding into the missions of other science agencies in the federal government. For example, for the advancement of health, which of course we predominantly associate with the NIH, for innovations in the energy sector at DOE, and through advancements in agriculture at USDA. So discoveries that were made through NSF funding, as well as the scientists themselves who were trained with NSF support, wind up furthering these specific missions. So where does the NSF budget stand as of right now? So this graph just shows NSF appropriations over the last 20 or so years. And the picture is, I'm sorry to say, somewhat mixed. Although in current dollars, what we're calling here actual dollars, the budget of NSF has sort of slowly risen since the late 1990s with a few ups and downs here and there. If you adjust for inflation, that means that that implies that the NSF budget has really remained roughly flat for the last 15 or more years. And this is unfortunate because there is an ever-growing demand for scientific knowledge. There's an ever-growing demand for the discoveries that will be driving our economy and our nation's interests forward. And so we are somewhat disappointed with the fact that there hasn't been this robust support and the sort of robust, sustained increases you would hope to see for the NSF. Up to the current moment, we are, of course, in appropriation season here in Washington, D.C. And so House and Senate appropriations committees have just recently put forward their proposals for what they want the agency budget to be for FY19. Fiscal year 19, of course, begins October 1st. And there is some good news here. So as you see on the left-hand side, the current budget for the National Science Foundation is $7.8 billion. And both the House and the Senate have proposed increases. The House proposed an increase of approximately 5%, up to $8.2 billion. The Senate number is slightly lower, but still a fairly robust increase of 4%, up to $8.1 billion. So we're encouraged that in this fiscal year, Given there have been some the constraints on the budget have been relaxed somewhat thanks to negotiations that have lifted the Budget Control Act caps, and we are pushing forward and hoping that Congress will enact these increases for NSF as soon as possible. And this is actually where you come in. So you might be asking yourselves, as an advocate, what can I do to support the NSF? So we encourage you to take action. This can be a relatively small time commitment, for example, sending an email or making a phone call to your elected representatives. Of course, I will go into this in a few minutes, but we also encourage you to actually meet your representatives and senators when they are home in their states and districts. It's something we've been pushing now for the last couple of years. Every member of the House of Representatives and every senator has local offices in their states and districts. These are places that are staffed full-time, so you can actually go and talk to staff members about your concerns as a constituent at any time. We also, of course, encourage you to use social media to connect with your elected officials, and just more broadly, for those of you especially who are scientists, we encourage you to take your role seriously to educate and inform the public about the importance of basic research. So just briefly, FASEB has a lot of resources available to help you be an advocate for science. If you go to our website, www.faseb.org, you'll see a tab entitled Science Policy, Advocacy, and Communications. If you click there, you'll see a drop-down appear with a lot of this information. We especially encourage you to take a look at the Become an Advocate link. This is really sort of your one-stop shop for how to be engaged in the political process and make your voice heard for science. In particular, I'm very fond of this one. If you click on the link called Legislative Action Center, you'll see a web form like this pop up. This is actually a way for you to locate your elected officials. So if you don't know who your member of Congress is, you can fill in your zip code, and it might ask you for a few more details about your home address, but it will give you the names as well as the contact information for your senators as well as your representatives. In particular, it will not only include the office contact information here in Washington, D.C., but will also include information about those local offices I just mentioned. So where you can go locally to talk to your representatives, talk to your senators, or at least talk to their staff. So as I was saying, more and more we encourage you, you don't have to travel to Washington to be an advocate. As I've been saying, our website includes lots of information about how to contact your senators and representatives in your home states and districts. I should say you can set up these meetings with staff in local offices at any time. It doesn't have to be during a congressional recess. They do have people on staff year-round. And it's also a good way for you just to sort of forge connections with these offices. So, for example, by developing a relationship and a rapport with staff in those offices, you can ask about public appearances of your elected representatives. For example, when will your representative or senator attend a town hall meeting or have a constituent breakfast or coffee meeting or office hours, et cetera. So this is really a great way for sort of small d democracy in action to move forward. Just for your information, there are a couple of upcoming congressional recesses, one around July 4th and then later this summer. I should say there's a small asterisk there on the summer recess. It's not yet clear exactly when the Senate will be in recess because there's been some political back and forth about whether or not the Senate will actually go on recess. But as I was saying, even if your member of Congress or your senator is not back home, you can still attend one of these local meetings and make your voice heard. So to that end, the same website I just mentioned under our Become an Advocate tab here, we have a whole host of information about how to request a meeting with an elected official, including sample text for sort of email or letter you might write. Email is probably the best way to go. Postal mail can sometimes be a little slow if you're trying to schedule a meeting, particularly in short notice. And then once you've scheduled your meeting, we have a whole host of information here about how to prepare for your meeting. So what kind of information you might want to bring with you, what kind of background research you might want to do about your representative senators, for example, what positions they've taken before on the budgets for science or on science policy. So again, I strongly encourage you to take a look at our website and please do feel free to use all the resources there. Just to discuss in a little bit more detail about information we provide for these meetings. So again, all of this is freely available on our website. The next few slides are the sorts of things that you might want to review yourselves and also bring to one of these congressional meetings. These are wonderful things to leave behind so that congressional staff actually have in their hands information about the importance of NSF-funded research. Just not long ago, we produced this NSF fact sheet. This has a lot of the information Andre discussed about what the agency does today, areas of research it supports, as well as some examples of cutting-edge life sciences research, some recent breakthroughs that were funded by NSF. We have state and district funding information for states and districts across the country. Again, this is all on our website. This is all free to download. You're welcome to use for your advocacy. You just when you go to the website, you'll see that there's this map. You just click on the outline of a state, and another box will pop up, and you can just select your district as well as pick information about the statewide resources going to research. And I should say that we try to be quite comprehensive. These fact sheets cover most districts across the country. They cover all 50 states. And they also include information, as you can see on this slide, not just about the National Science Foundation, but of course also funding from the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Energy. So whatever agency you want to discuss, we have the information about funding there available. In addition, as we do every year, we put out information on what we think the budgets for the science agencies ought to be, our federal funding recommendations. These are also available on our website in a PDF brochure that you can download. And again, this is a sort of a vision for the sustained, predictable increases for the science agencies we'd like to see this year and moving forward. There's a whole host of other additional advocacy resources. I encourage you to please check out our website. One I want to highlight here, this page is under the tab Benefits of Biomedical Research, is a slide deck entitled The Value of Biological Research. This is actually an entire sort of PowerPoint presentation about why investments in basic life sciences research are so critical for our nation. So this is actually a whole set of slides that you can download, the sort of thing you could bring to a public event, to a meeting with a member of Congress, and it really offers a wealth of information about why this research is so important. So we have some other tools to stay engaged. Please sign up to receive our e-action alerts, as you can do so via these web links. We also encourage you to subscribe to our bi-weekly Washington Update newsletter. This way you can stay up to date on the latest happenings in Congress and how they're affecting the scientific community. We also encourage you to follow us on social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter at the following websites. We have a pretty active social media presence, and we would love for you to engage with us there as well. One final thing, please mark your calendars. We have an upcoming webinar on summer advocacy. I've already touched upon briefly some of the ways that you can get involved at a local level. We will cover this information and more in a webinar next week. It's a week from today, June 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you want more information about how you can engage your elected officials, about the importance of life sciences research, please do attend this webinar next week. And with that, that concludes the formal part of our presentation, but we would be happy to take any questions that you might have. Just to reiterate, please use this Q&A tool on the webinar software to submit your questions, and we would be happy to answer them. Okay, so it looks like there's a few coming in here. This is the first question here. Okay, how is the biological research funded by NSF different from that which is funded by the NIH, by the National Institutes of Health? Andre, do you want to
Sure. So
tackle that one?
Absent of the NIH, of course, is a biomedical research funding agency. The NSF is not. The difference is that the biological research the NSF funds and supports is not disease focused. So outside of the NSF funding ecological research or bioengineering that's not medically focused, that's kind of the big takeaway. If it's not disease focused, then it's not it's NSF ready. If it's disease focused, then it's NIH ready. Again, I mentioned ecological research is also the math and physics of biology and of life sciences. That's kind of the difference. There is some biophysics that's supported at the NIH, but it's again disease focused. So that's kind of if my research is disease focused, then it is NIH. It should go to the NIH. If it's not, then I should check the NSF.
Okay, this is a question sort of along similar lines, actually. Will it reduce the chance of being funded if an NSF grant application is medically focused? Andre, what are your thoughts on that?
So they may say, so if it's medically focused, then they'll likely tell you that you should apply to the National Institutes of Health. If your protein or your particular molecule has medical implications, then that may fit into an NSF a biology program or life science program. But if it's disease driven, if the research is disease driven, then that would more than likely disqualify you for an NSF focused research topic.
Okay. Question here. Can studying mechanism of disease prevention be in line with NSF? So along the similar lines to what Andre was saying, please jump in as well. I think, again, it depends a little bit on the emphasis. Right. So, for example, if you're studying a basic biochemical pathway or a gene network or something, you may have some idea beforehand that has some medical implication. But the Directorate and other parts of NSF do fund very fundamental research into those kinds of biological processes, even that do have medical relevance. But it's a matter of whether or not your research proposal sort of goes in the direction of curing a specific disease or towards a treatment as opposed to understanding the basic biology.
Yeah, that's 100%. That's 100% correct. If you think of it as writing your manuscript for a journal, if you talk about the medical implications in your discussion, but not throughout your paper, then your paper is about the mechanism, and that's more NSF. That's more of an NSF topic. If your paper is about the disease and the mechanism, then that would be more NIH focused.
All right, so this is another sort of question about the relationship between NSF and the other agencies. If there are other mission-oriented funding agencies, isn't the NSF redundant? I think the answer to that is a resounding no. For a few reasons. First of all, as I said, NSF is unique in the sense that it has a broad mandate to support fundamental research across scientific disciplines. No other agency has that kind of ability to fund research in a very interdisciplinary fashion and indeed foster collaborations among those disciplines. Moreover, NSF, because it has this unique role in funding very fundamental research, provides the lion's share of funding actually for many disciplines. So this is getting a little outside of the life sciences. But areas like mathematics, economics, computer science, these are places where, or academic fields, I should say, which really have nowhere else to turn within the federal system for support. So without NSF, there are whole sort of academic fields that would really would sort of grind to a halt. As I sort of hinted at before, the NSF also serves as a sort of cornerstone function, a cornerstone of the basic research enterprise, and that again through basic knowledge, the growth in basic knowledge, and also the training of people through its education programs, and in fact doesn't repeat or overlap necessarily with the other science agencies, but really offers as a sort of an upstream source of that scientific capital that allows the mission-oriented agencies to do what they do. Does NSF provide funding for scientific equipment such as a large microscope? If so, what kind of equipment will NSF fund? Yes, that's a great question. Indeed, NSF does have funding for scientific equipment and instruments. The the basic gist of it is that there are mechanisms for funding sort of very large-scale instrumentation, the so-called Major Research Facilities Equipment Construction Account, MREFC, it's a bit of a mouthful, is one part of the NSF budget. That funds very large and very expensive scientific projects, things like large telescopes, research vessels, things that are on the order of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to construct. There are also smaller grant programs that are designed to fund things that are more on the scale of what an individual investigator might want for his or her laboratory. For example, a microscope you might find in a life sciences laboratory. But Andre, do you want to say a little bit about the mid-scale part? This is the new NSF initiative to fund sort of things in the middle.
Right. So I think you touched on it because I briefly went through the big ideas. The mid-scale is one of the processes. These are already, the big ideas and the mid-scale, as well as Includes, these are all initiatives that have been ongoing. So the MRFC is a budget that they pull a lot of that funding from. The Math and Physical Sciences Directorate, they kind of lead, they have a large pot of money that is for instrumentation that biologists can use, that physicists can use, et cetera. Each grant as well, and most of the research directorates that deal with grants that deal with more the natural sciences or more of the hard sciences, quote unquote, has a pot of money that researchers can use to invest in new infrastructure or new instruments for their science and for their projects. In addition, the HBCU UP program, the advanced program, as well as the new Hispanic Serving Institutions program also provides money for researchers to increase the capacity for their institutions. So HSIs, HBCUs, which generally or typically don't have as much funding as other institutions, they have pots of money in those programs to help investigators at those institutions to create or build infrastructure and capacity to conduct more elaborate studies.
Great. Okay, so a few more questions here about how NSF issues grants. How do we find contact information for program manager for division to send our research summary? I would say that sort of information is available on the NSF website.
Right. If you go to the Biological Directorate's page, if you just search in Google or whatever your search engine of choice, Bio NSF, it'll bring you to the Bio front page. If you click on programs, you can click the specific programs. All the program directors' information should be readily available, their email address as well as their phone number. I've heard from them that they prefer email first before you begin to bombard their phones. So shoot them an email, let them know what you're interested in, what your topic is, send them a one-page summary, and then they'll vet it internally and may send it to another program director and get back to you.
Okay, so here's one. We sort of touched upon this already. Could you say more about the connection between what NSF does and the other funding agencies? Sure. So as we sort of already touched upon, in some ways NSF is, you could think of it as perhaps the research it funds as being sort of upstream of some of the more applied areas of research that are funded through other agencies. So, for example, a research project might begin as a very sort of a fundamental research project trying to investigate some biological process or mechanism, and then just through serendipity that has unforeseen health implications or implications for other areas of applied research. Perhaps one of the most noteworthy examples of this in recent years is the discovery of gene editing technology, CRISPR-Cas9 being the most prominent example of this. Among those working on this in this area, Jennifer Doudna, who's an investigator at the University of California, Berkeley, initially was funded through the National Science Foundation. She was simply looking into biological mechanisms of how bacteria, that is how microbes, defend themselves against invaders, and it was through these very basic research types of investigations that they came upon the system that now is having these massive implications for not just research, but also for medicine, for agriculture, because these are technologies that allow us to manipulate the sequence of individual genes. So that's just one example of how so the basic research funded by NSF then goes on to have these other sort of much broader implications. Another facet of this, of course, is as we've already talked about, is education. In some ways, it's the NSF trained scientists and the knowledge that they generate that allows the other agencies to do what they do. Just one sort of anecdote off the top of my head. If you think about, for example, what goes on in our nation's national laboratories. These are large scientific facilities, many of them managed by the Department of Energy, and they have a critical role in the advancement of science and technology in our country, and indeed are populated by lots of young scientist students and postdocs, et cetera. But it's not really the case that you can be a graduate student of a national laboratory. In fact, you're a graduate student getting your degree in a university that might be affiliated with a national laboratory, and then indeed, as a person in a grad program, you will probably at some point have support from the National Science Foundation. So these are just different ways in which the NSF is connected and supporting the broader national research enterprise.
Yeah.
Now that submission deadlines have been eliminated, is there still a good time in the year to submit NSF grants? Well, so this is getting a little bit into the weeds of some policy changes at NSF, but just within the last several months, the Directorate at NSF announced that they'd be switching to a no deadlines system. Basically, instead of having one or more deadlines per year for submission of grant proposals, instead they would go to a rolling system where you could submit a proposal throughout the year. And then they would be subject to, as the agency says, they would still be subject to the same kinds of, the same rigor and the same merit review processes that any other grants would receive. And as far as I know, I think the agency is still working on the details of how that will be rolled out within Bio. Andre, do you have some more insights into this?
Some more insights. So the Directorate did last year. The Engineering Directorate also removed their deadlines for their core programs. Again, as for their core programs, there are still programs within the engineering and bio that still remain on deadlines. From my understanding through our conversations with NSF and their staff, for the directorates that are conducting this no deadline system, the removal is an attempt to allow researchers at all levels to submit when their proposals are ready, and they will be formulating panels based on a 2-month, I want to say 2-month time period. So every 2 months or every couple months, they'll collect the proposals, and then they will put together a panel. The Directorate has not, to be fair, the Directorate has not really put out much guidance on how they're conducting panels because this is a new process for them. Neither has the Engineering Directorate. So we're still trying to figure that out, but it seems like they're waiting till they get it in, and periodically throughout the year they will be reviewing proposals. That's the best I can tell you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's still a work in progress, a very new policy that they're still working on getting off the ground. All right. According to the FASEB fact sheet, my congressional district does not get a lot of money from NSF. What can I say to my representative to convince him or her that NSF funding is important, even though it doesn't benefit the district directly? Well, some of what we've already sort of talked about in terms of NSF's role in supporting science and innovation broadly is something that it could resonate. Another aspect, of course, is that even if the amount of money is not very large, it can still have a very profound effect. So, for example, a relatively small education grant to a local college or community college or even a primary secondary school, that is something that is, still very important to the constituents in that district. And of course, we do like to talk about, in the broad scale, things that benefit everyone. Many of the sort of innovations that we use in our daily lives and take for granted, like the smartphones in our pockets, often can be traced to fundamental NSF-funded research. So that's something that does benefit people really everywhere across the country.
Right, and I'll just add that the Education and Human Resources Directorate deals with a lot of creating new pilots, creating new ways of teaching. students about STEM, as well as teaching in general, also re-educating the community and the older community who need re-education for the new jobs of now and the future that deal more in STEM. And that happens in the EHR and the NSF and across the whole agency. So though there may not be a large institution within that district, or it may not be much money feeding into that district, there is, as Ben mentioned, this tangential relationship and this kind of feeding off of everything else that NSF is supporting.
Okay. What are some other examples of important breakthrough support of NSF? Well, so we've mentioned, as we've mentioned already, there are a number of things. Some of them sort of present in our daily lives, we take for granted. Others perhaps a bit more technical. So, for example, I mentioned gene editing and CRISPR-Cas9 is something that has come about recently. Again, the underpinnings of that have their origins in NSF-supported research, and this is having a huge effect in the biomedical and the agricultural fields. There are lots of things from MRI, which technology that's critically important in medicine, the internet, modern weather forecasting, the algorithm for Google. These are all things that have their roots in one way or another in NSF-funded research. So there's really many things about the technology that we have today that have their origins in what the NSF does. Should also say that some recent headlines about some critical breakthroughs in the sciences also have received NSF support. For example, the discovery of gravitational waves. This is something in physics. It's a phenomenon that was understood or predicted by theory, but had not actually been shown, and yet a very long-term investment by the NSF in scientific facilities as well as people and research led to this groundbreaking discovery, which has generated a lot of buzz and really is sort of a feather in the cap of the agency. I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about what NSF discoveries have enabled, to go to their website. In particular, if you go to, there's an About NSF tab, I believe, on their website, and under that there's something I think it's called the NSF Toolkit, and there's a lot of documentation about these and other examples. In particular, there's a report called Transforming the World Through Science that the agency puts out, and this is something where you can really read up and learn more about really how important these investments in science and research are. Okay, so we're coming up on the hour. So let's see if there's just maybe one more question here. So I've heard stories about particular kinds of research being frivolous or quote-unquote waste of taxpayer dollars. How does NSF ensure that worthwhile science is being funded? Well, this has become something of a contentious political topic. There's a history of this, actually, these kinds of discussions in D.C. I should just say very broadly that my understanding is NSF takes its responsibility as a steward of public money very seriously, and NSF has a very rigorous merit review process to ensure that it's really only funding the best possible science and is using taxpayer dollars wisely. Andre, do you want to say
right? So,
about that?
So I'll second that. They tout their panel review process as the gold standard, but I think everybody does. But included in there, so there's the merit review process. There is the merit of the research that is heavily scrutinized by the panelists, but there's also broader impacts. So it's not just how the science is contributing to the science, but how it contributes to the U.S. public, and that includes how much outreach is this researcher conducting, how does this research impact everyday lives of the constituents, or the people around the researcher, and that's all. So the broader impacts for NSF projects, as well as their merit, are weighed equally, which some people have an issue with, but that's a way that NSF ensures that not only is the taxpayer dollar being properly used, but they are also benefiting from this researcher receiving taxpayer dollars.
Okay. Great. Well, we are just now coming on 3 p.m. Eastern, so I think we will probably be wrapping things up here. But I just want to thank you once again for joining us for today's webinar. Please do engage with us on social media and tune in for upcoming webinars. Also want to thank my co-host here, Andre Porter, again for joining us today. And thanks again.